Marina Warner, welcome to the Prokhoff Center and the Global Humanities Initiative.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Henk.
Marina, you describe yourself as a writer and a mythographer. I know what a writer is, but what is a mythographer?
Well, it literally means writing myths, and it usually means writing about myths. But it can mean that you actually write mythic stories. And it really arose that I call myself that because when I had a website made for the first time, the designer said, you need a search term that will not just be writer, it's too vague. What kind of writing do you do? And I said, well, I write a lot about fairy tales and myths. He says, is there a word for that? I said, well, I suppose you could say mythographer, but it's very heavy and pompous. But the funny thing is that it has a sort of slightly Germanic ring, a sort of philological history of that kind of scholarship. It's a bit heavy. And of course, it also has the slightly comic, ironic ring that it's sort of Casaubon from Middlemarch.
Yes.
You know, he's trying to write the key of all mythologies. He is a supreme mythographer. So it has a, it's a word with slightly uneasy resonance. But I have noticed, actually, that with the rise of interest in fairy tales, which I think is pretty marked, and the return, at least, of discussion around myth in ways that was not the case that when I was sort of in my 30s, when myths were rather derided and thought of as both classical fustian literature, not looking at the real world, not taking account of what is actually going on in the world, but sort of disappearing into a fanciful irrelevance, or worse, a kind of fascistic maneuver whereby you mobilize false ideas to inspire a crowd. The fascists used a lot of mythology, and that threw a tremendous shadow over the whole enterprise of writing myths.
Yeah.
So the word at the time when I first had this website had a lot of these ambivalent repercussions, resonances. But I've actually noticed, in the same ways you've just picked it up, that people are more responsive to the term now, actually.
So what is it that you were trying to do when you started off as a mythographer? You've subjected myths to critical analysis, haven't you?
Well, I really began close to sort of structural anthropology and deconstruction in the 70s. And when those Roland Barthes mythologies was probably the key text about the role of myths as ideology.
Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from Roland Barthes, who's someone that not everyone might be familiar with?
Well, Roland Barthes was a philosopher and a kind of beautiful writer too, actually, which is sometimes the case with the French. They produce people who have a sort of lyrical style and are very interested in the textures of human feeling and experience, but are at the same time scholars. And Barthes was of that kind. He was a very inspiring thinker and writer. And he collected some pieces that he'd actually written for newspapers about icons of French nationalism, the Eiffel Tower. And famously, I think on the cover of the book, was a black French soldier saluting the Republican flag. And he deconstructed these as myths, which refused to examine the historical process behind these things, that they just assume that these are good, that these are symbols of excellence. So he unpacked the black soldier saluting or singing to the Marseillaise, or what this meant in terms of concealing colonial attitudes, concealing French imperialism in Africa. So Barthes was a deconstructionist, and he was very, very against myths.
One of the things that Roland Barthes says is that myth transforms history and myth transforms culture into nature. Can you explain what he means by that?
He actually says turns it into, doesn't transform. I think that he would not like the term transform because it actually implies a process of slow metamorphosis, whereas what he's saying is that this is an ideological imprint that happens and removes questioning, removes interrogation, and of the receivers of the myth, of the ideology. So it's a political critique of myth, and it's very rooted in French traditions of rationality. Jean-Pierre Vernant, who was pretty much a contemporary of Barthes, but lived a bit longer, he might even have been younger than Barthes, because he fought in the partisans, in the Maquis when he was in his teens in the south of France against the German occupation and against Vichy. So Vernant is a tremendous hero figure and a great classical philologist. And he came in at the same time around as Barthes with a very fine essay called The Reason of Myth, in which he argues that actually just in the same way as Sophocles or Aeschylus or Plato actually adapted and thought through myths about questions of statecraft, questions of individual responsibility. Even Plato, who decried myths, says at the end of the Republic, the myth will save us. So Plato, in spite of his hatred of storytellers and poets and so forth, could himself not totally pull away from the idea that what we think of as imagination can actually create constructs and raise questions against the prevailing idées reçues or prejudices or ideological impositions of any regime. And I think now the interesting developments in cognitive science actually show that you can't think of imagination and reason as separate faculties. Almost every thinker about the brain and the human mind in the past put them in different compartments. So memory, memoria and fantasia, in particular, memory and fantasy, and then reason and imagination, would be allotted different spheres. But it's now shown in the, when they examine the brain, and I don't like the reductionism of too much of this kind of cognitive science, but they now know that if I say to you, lady, a leopard sat under a juniper tree, you bring it up in your mind's eye, with the same faculty, the same part of your brain starts firing, as if I say to you, what did you have for breakfast? So the faculties of reason, imagination, memory and fantasy are not happening in completely different compartments. And for that reason, I just finished with this, for that reason I believe strongly that we need to operate as much as we can with our imaginations as a faculty of thinking. Thought experiments are stories, and stories have been used in the past, as I said, in Greek myths, Greek tragedies and so forth, to think about these questions. And we could continue to do that. We don't have to think, we have to think always rationally.
Are you saying that there are two elements to myth, or two sides to myth, as it were? Myth has the power to entrench social prejudice and injustice, but there's also a positive element to myth which sort of opens up and can be emancipatory. Are there those two dimensions to myth?
Depends.
Is that your...
Well, it's not binary, because a story, the same story, will elicit totally different responses in with different receptions. So, Aeschylus, a very good example. The Oresteia at the end decrees that the mother doesn't count in the identity of a person, only the father counts. So it's an absolute decree from the gods that paternity is what matters. Therefore, when Orestes killed his mother because she had killed the father, he was innocent, because it's the father who matters. Well, this play has not died ever, because that decree is a question, a fundamental question about human society. And the play asks it. You may think that the decree at the end is what we're meant to agree with, but it is very possible for the audience to disagree. It is very possible for the audience to say, "Ah," when Apollo says that, because it's manifestly not what we now accept. But the question has been opened. You know, what Vernant says is that the hero of a tragedy is an object of debate. And that's the point, that you can, so how you can't predict the response, but you can, of any given society at any one time. Obviously it's a very plural, fluid situation, but it's very important, I think, not to abdicate from attempting to use this extremely powerful tool, which is the imaginative, fantastic story. The incredible, vicious, blood-soaked story of the Oresteia. And to use that to put these kinds of questions.
Coming back to Roland Barthes, would you say that your early work, and I'm thinking especially on the work that you've done on the Virgin Mary, that is closer to Roland Barthes in the sense that it focuses more on the potentially pernicious elements of myth?
Well, it was that book which I wrote in the 70s has actually lasted astonishingly. It's still in print, but it is definitely a product of that period. However, it's a very conflicted book in the sense that I fall under the spell. You can see that I'm under the spell of all the very beautiful paintings, music, rituals, churches, you name it, embroideries, that have been created through the inspiration of this mother virgin figure. So, in a sense, I intuited something that I would come to wish more later, that this power of storytelling and fabrication can hold people in thrall. And interestingly, they asked me to do a new introduction to it when it was reissued about 2 years ago. And the meaning of the Virgin Mary has changed considerably because, to be very quick about it, the Church is discredited as a sexual monitor because of all the scandals, and also to some extent discredited in other ways for the Vatican Bank and so forth. So its authority has actually lessened, and as a result of that, the symbols, like the powerful symbols like the Virgin Mary, have become more available to the people, the actual faithful, to mould in their own, according to their own desires. And Mary has become a very strong goddess figure for the poor in certain countries, and much more emancipatory than she was when I was brought up in the 50s. However, you can also say that the old Barthesian idea and the Marxist idea that a figure like the Virgin Mary is a tool for keeping the poor happy so that they won't rebel, you can say that is still the case, since contraception and abortion and so forth, women's rights have not been acknowledged in spite of the rise of Mary as a figure to protect women.
Yes, I think it's one of the key elements of your thinking that myth and storytelling is protean and keeps changing and is dynamic. But coming back again to what you said just now about the potentially repressive dimension of that myth, could you elaborate a little bit on that? So what is the role that for a long time, or the function that for a very long time, the myth and the cult of the Virgin Mary have
Well,
had?
Mary, of course, was portrayed over a very long period as a submissive, meek, and suffering figure who had been spared the taint of sexuality, either in her own conception from her mother, that's the Immaculate Conception, that she is the only woman ever to have been created, in fact the only human being ever to be created without original sin, except for Jesus, and that she was spared corruption, bodily corruption in death, and assumed into heaven entire. She and Jesus are the only people in heaven with bodies at the moment. At the resurrection they'll be joined by all of us, but at the moment they're the only two people. It must be very lonely up there with all the ghosts. Anyway, then so she, her whole being, the whole way that she's represented, or was represented, it's just slightly changed now as I say, but in the 50s and 60s when I was growing up, was as the absolute counterpoise to what was the condition of all women. All women were steeped in sin, they were occasions of sin. We were always being warned by the nuns not to be occasions of sin. And it was our fault if we were aggressed by men because we were occasions of sin. This kind of thinking, which is now, it's been pretty much deconstructed, I think, now. But so
is the idea that the positive elements, the ideal, as it were, is projected onto the Virgin Mary, but then that has the effect that all the other women, the real women, the empirical women, fall short of that, as it were, and then all become Eves and sinful and sexual beings that one must be afraid of.
Yeah, it's a need to renounce their sexuality in order to achieve, as it were, any kind of possibility of redemption. That's the other aspect of it. I mean, the book is called after a prayer, very early prayer in Latin, that alone of all her sex she pleased the Lord. So this is why I called it that, alone of all her sex. She's the only woman who to be spared this sort of, as it were, mark of the devil. But the stories are, they're very multifarious, and one of the things the Reformation swept away is and I'm sort of increasingly interested now in the effects of iconoclasm on narrative, because the iconoclasts, wished to strip the churches of ritual, superstition, pilgrimage, processions, and of course the intercession of the saints. And the effect of that actually was very deeply a thinning of narrative, because the saints all came with their stories. And Mary herself had, which the reformers on the whole didn't like, not in England nor in any of the European countries. They didn't like all these miracle stories in which Mary would do very kind things, like a woman would get pregnant, a woman in a convent, a nun, would get pregnant by a priest, and Mary would take her place so that she could go and have the baby secretly, and then leave the baby with foster parents and come back to the nunnery and become a nun again. And Mary would then go back, but who would take her place? Oh, this, of course, is this kind of merciful, popular miracle story which was circulating in Europe very widely. I discovered that there's a magnificent series of frescoes that were whitewashed by the iconoclasts in Eton College Chapel, which tell all these amazing stories about Mary helping distressed women, or women who unfortunately had fallen into sexual conduct and misconduct, and other transgressions. But sometimes she also acts as a kind of dominatrix, sort of femme fatale. There are wonderful, which have been taken up by operas and later, wonderful almost fairy tales about how Mary, somebody in their youth says that devotes himself to Mary forever and ever, and then of course is distracted by some passing beauty and is unfaithful to Mary, whereupon she appears in his bedroom and claims him. There's a Prosper Mérimée short story, La Vénus d'Île, which is this story about the Mary statue leaning out and seizing her unfaithful votary. So this kind of fanciful story was banned by the Reformation, and it shows Mary in a very different light. The kind of Catholicism I was brought up in England was very affected by the Reformation. It had very strong Calvinist and this touch upon it of not liking this festive, rather merciful, indulgent side of Catholicism in the medieval past.
Yes, and one of the characteristics of your approach is that you try and locate myth historically and socially and culturally. Isn't that the case?
Yes, definitely. No, I became, after my sort of, as it were, period of deconstruction. Actually, even in the Virgin Mary book, which I then went to write a book about Joan of Arc, but even in the Virgin Mary book, I became very aware that historically she was utterly metamorphic, and that one needed to put history back into it, and that there were interactions between social laws and social norms and such figures, and how they both reinforced and sometimes interrogated. I mean, it isn't easy to pinpoint, you can't put your finger exactly on it, but it's definitely the case that if you have a lot of stories in which the Jew is an infidel and a blasphemer and is punished and a servant of the devil, that is going to interact with the values in the society. They're not hermetically sealed from social realities. Yes. But it seems very obvious that to us now, but it really wasn't very obvious in the past, and it's very difficult to know how to respond. But there is one way that I think you can show that people have really understood this and wish to respond to it. And that is that some of the best imaginative work with fairy tales and myths is done by utopian children's writers. And that has been the case since, certainly C.S. Lewis, certainly Philip Pullman now, even though he hates C.S. Lewis, but nevertheless Philip Pullman now, and he's got a new book coming out. He's a really, quite a profound political thinker and religious thinker, Philip Pullman, but a marvelous storyteller. And he infuses into his adventure stories these ideas that he has about, tolerance and justice and sexual equality. Yeah. And he's by no means, he's in a long line of English thinkers like that. Even Lewis Carroll. Alice is a figure who is standing, sturdy little girl who is really curious, and she's standing up with her common sense to the phantasmic tyrannies of the adult world. Wonderland is an exaggerated parody of the Victorian world,
Mm.
intolerance and rules.
Before we look at fairy tales, some fairy tales in more detail, you mentioned a book about Joan of Arc, and what I find one of the most fascinating sections there is it in? I'm not sure what's in that book or it's a different book, but there's one place in your work where you talk about Margaret Thatcher as Britannia. Can you say a little bit more about that?
That's in Monuments and Maidens, which is the book that followed Joan of Arc. I mean, they're connected. Actually, every book I write is connected to the one before. It's another set of questions. So, just to backtrack, Joan of Arc was a figure who is extremely richly documented historically, and yet she has not escaped this series of symbolic and mythological projections. So even if you have the most detailed trial, 2 trials in fact, that we have in Western history, every word she says written down, nevertheless you cannot escape this mythological use. And unfortunately we're seeing it very strongly now because the Front National in France has adopted her as their heroine, in spite of the fact that she stood up for freedom and etc. But the connection is that a woman like Mrs. Thatcher, when she came to power, and because she was belligerent in her foreign policy as well, was seen as a kind of Joan of Arc. But we don't really have in Britain or in England a cult of Joan of Arc quite in the same way as France does. So, but we have this armoured heroine who is kind of Boadicea plus the allegory of Great Britain, Britannia. And when Mrs. Thatcher rode into, for the Falklands, she was cartooned, and the Iron Lady, as she had become in the cartoons, was then morphed into the figure of Britannia, defending us against the aggressors of the Argentinians, defending the Falklanders against the Argentinians. And
that sounds like a good thing, but actually you're very critical of that.
Oh yes, no. I'm not terribly keen on the Joan of Arc as the military aggressive heroine. I'm much more interested in Joan of Arc as a figure of the unjustly accused prisoner, the prisoner of conscience.
It's interesting that you talk about Joan of Arc, and there are all these female symbols: Joan of Arc, justice, the Statue of Liberty, Britannia, and that seems like an elevation or adoration of women. But you're saying there's a downside to it as well.
Well, it's a very glaring contradiction that the Statue of Liberty was put up in the harbour of New York as a gift from the French to the Americans at a time when the women did not have the vote. I mean, freedom was embodied, symbolized as a woman, and that was the fabric of cities. That was the subject of my book, Monuments and Maidens. The fabric of cities. I'm sure Sheffield has many, many examples. I probably used to know what they were because I used to look at all the cities and try and look at their allegories. But even electricity was at first a nymph. Gas was a nymph. The telephone on the Hôtel de Ville, I think it is in Paris, le téléphone is actually a female nymph. So the idea that that women did not embody action, but the actual concept, the abstract concept, because women were not doers, not makers, not doers and makers or agents. Women were the projections of. So this idea that we in our gender were simply the vehicles of concepts and projections is a place where you can argue from. I mean, if you are embodying freedom, maybe if you seize your voice, if you are liberty, you can seize your voice and use that. I mean, that's possible, but we haven't quite got there yet.
Yeah. So those are the two sides again. It's like you've got the symbol, say the Statue of Liberty or Joan of Arc, and then all these positive qualities are projected onto that. So justice, freedom, and all the rest of it. But in the real world, the empirical world, all that is missing. So it's almost like the symbol takes care of the ideal, so that you don't strive for the ideal in reality.
Yes.
And you're saying that's the danger of myth and that kind of symbols, but at the same time, you can then actually try and use that to your advantage.
One of the things about allegories and monuments in general is that they're pretty invisible. I mean, it would be no discredit to you if you can't name a single statue in Sheffield. They only become visible when there's a controversy about them. If the hero on the pedestal suddenly becomes known to be a slave owner or a criminal of some kind, or the politics that he stood for are discredited, then he will become visible again. On the whole, statues of justice, or even the telephone, or gas, are pretty invisible. They're kind of decoration. But this is Barthes' point. It's never the fact that they're invisible is actually more effective because they're latent. And what you need to do is, once you bring them into visibility, as happens with the statue, you then have a debate and a discussion. And actually, since pretty much the 80s, I think, a lot of artists have used allegory again. And there's and a lot of writers too. There are numerous examples now in which allegory is reoccupied to tell alternative stories. And that's a very, very good move, I think.